Hello, and welcome to the quick review of colonial America through the Civil War in preparation for the APUS history test. Just as a quick overview, the test itself has a different structure this year. We've been talking about all year, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. Then the first part, you'll take a multiple choice question. You'll have 55 questions, 55 minutes to answer it. That's about 40% of the exam. You'll then have a short answer, which are the ones that are like A, B, C, that you answer each portion of it. You get 4 questions and 45 minutes to answer that, and that's 25%, or sorry, 20% of the exam. You then have your DBQ, which again, to remember, you should use half plus one of the documents. And then you have your long essay, the two sides of it. There will be one question from prior to the Civil War, one from after. We've talked about that probably the one you know best is the things after. If you have not already gone to this website, the Gilder Lehrman site, be sure that you go there. It is amazing. So each of these videos here will talk you through like exactly what to expect on each of the tests in like 2 to 3 minutes, which is really great. Then there's like historical thinking skills. Then there's a quiz video, and then there is a video like 8 to 10 minutes on each of the periods. Even rather than listening to this video, I think it would be helpful to go to this website and watch these videos. I would highly, highly, highly recommend them, particularly on the early days or over the different forms of writing that we haven't maybe talked about in quite such a long time. So, go ahead and get started on our review, going over some of the early U.S. history things. All right. Our major themes in history are work, exchange, technology, identity, ideas, beliefs, and culture, America and the world, environment, geography, politics, and power, and peopling. And each of these things we've done a timeline over, like you've looked at these trends over time. And so be sure that you could answer a question like how did work change in the United States in the period from colonization through the Civil War, something like that, which I think that you probably would be able to do. All right, so very early history. Remember that everyone first came to the Americas through that Bering Strait. Um, First was the Spanish colonization, then the French, then the British. We spent a very long time comparing the three of these. We even did a small project like comparing the three of them. We talked about the French having the best relationship with the natives because, again, they wanted to solidify trade relationships rather than conquer territory. So they needed the Native Americans there so that they could establish trade routes and things of this nature. So the main reason that this exploration happens is because of mercantilism. Europe is a very tiny area. There's not a lot of expansion. So Spain, France, Portugal, England, all of these places need new resources. They need land to expand to in order to gain their power. So basically, all of these different places like launch out. First, they're colonizing in Africa, other various places. When the New World is discovered, this becomes a new place for them to explore as well. The British are going to be a little bit late to the game, but they'll gain a foothold at Jamestown and then eventually all along that Atlantic seaboard. So the early colonial setup, we have the House of Burgesses in Jamestown in 1619. We said it's kind of ironic that their first setup of government is also the same year the first slave ship comes. So slavery and democracy or representative government are basically having the same time period. Up in the north, the Mayflower Compact in 1620 is this foundation of direct democracy. It's all the guys on the ship sign this thing saying these are the rules that we'll adhere to. Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1638 are the first written constitution, etc., etc. So each of the colonies are kind of setting up their own government, mostly because of this concept of salutary neglect, where Great Britain has its own problems, has its own things going on, so it doesn't have time to pay attention to the colonies. In the southern colonies, these are the first established: Virginia, Maryland, Carolinas, Georgia. These are mostly farming. We spent a very long time looking at the characteristics of these colonies, but mostly they're people coming for farming, for money, for wealth. In the case of Georgia, they're coming because they're being sent there. But the main goal down here is not to colonize and set up a new lifestyle. It is to colonize so that you can make some money. In New England, this is more of the colonization in order to set up a new form of life. These are separatists, these are people that are dissatisfied with the way life is going in Europe, and so they come to the New World in order to set up their own. Way of life. So the Puritans in 1620 are the best example of this. We talked about that even though they're coming because they are persecuted, this does not make them any more tolerant of others. And so it's going to be places like Rhode Island, like Maryland, that become more accepting of other people. In the middle colonies, we have New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware. These are sort of a mix between the two, we had said. These are set up in a lot of ways to get money, but also some of them are for establishment. So, example, Pennsylvania becomes a haven for the Quakers, so that's the reason they're established. But then in other places, it's for money that they are established. So comparison of them, we did that great DBQ over them. You also, I'm hoping somewhere in your notes, have that chart that compares them. I remember we wrote on the note cards and walked all around the room, dividing into groups. But in New England, it's going to be church membership and voting. Various things like this. In the middle colonies, the question is like who has the most say over them. In the Chesapeake, it's all about money, and in the Southern, again, all about money. The way that their economic systems are going to be set up in New England, it's lumber, fish, more of a diverse sort of society, a lot of trade. In the middle, again, more trade, a lot of wheat farming. The Chesapeake is going to be tobacco, and the South is going to be rice and indigo. So as far as like the economic systems go, the navigation acts are never enforced really until after the French and Indian War. So these colonies are going to be left to their own to sort of trade with whoever, to sell with whoever, and it's not going to really bother them much that they're selling to other persons than Great Britain. So they are going to get a little spoiled, as we said, in this idea that they get to basically trade with whoever they want and make as much income as they want. This, however, goes against this idea of mercantilism, that the colonies are there to support the mother country, and that they should not be trading with other people. So this is why they passed the Navigation Acts. This is why the triangular trade goes on and things of this nature. Remember that there is a economic system of indentured servitude, which is where people basically sell themselves into servitude. They work for a contract of somewhere around 7 years in order to pay for their passage. Life is pretty not great in Europe, and so they're basically giving up their rights to have their own freedom for 7 years so that they can escape this because they could not afford passage on their own. However, for a landowner, this is great because one, you get some labor, two, you get some land, and probably this indentured servant is going to die because conditions are just so terrible in the Chesapeake. There's malaria, there's other sorts of diseases rolling around. So the problem is, from the side of the planters, that the indentured servants start living longer and longer. Um, some of these former indentured servants are not too terribly pleased that they're not getting what they were promised, or they feel like they're being ostracized from society, which leads to Bacon's Rebellion, who, remember, is protesting these conditions. Basically, this ends up making these planters no longer want to use indentured servants, but instead want to use slaves who do not get freedom and therefore cannot protest their conditions. So the effect of Bacon's Rebellion is that basically we're not going to see any more indentured servitude, we're only going to see slavery. And we had talked that it's not that the Northerners are more moral, it's not that the Northerners have issues with slavery, it's that really the slavery is not a practical means in the North, because they're just not doing the same sort of labor intensive farming as they are in the Southern and the Chesapeake colonies. So we've covered that here. The Chesapeake, just do remember, it is a large amount, and this will continue to be the case until the Civil War. So, economic systems, sort of an overview. Make sure that you know what the different economic systems are of the colonies. These are incredibly important because this is what's leading to their growth and development, and this is what's leading to them becoming their own distinct societies, which they've become by the eve of the American Revolution. Um, When we are talking about the northern colonies in particular, religion is an incredibly important part. Although it is still going to play a role in everything because this is still, the 1700s. So the role of religion will be strong, but it will be stronger in the north. So we have a really huge population growth. Mostly it's just because conditions are nice in the New World. There's lots of food, there's lots of things are healthy, like after they clean up the swamps and various things like this. So we see a natural increase, but also like lots of immigrants. Many Scots Irish moved to the or what will become the United States, these British colonies, also Germans, also others, because this is really seen as this sort of like promised land, this land of bounty. Um, in New England, education is the name of the game. Do you remember that 16 years after landing at Plymouth Rock, they've got Harvard set up. So they have extremely high literacy rates. We looked at the New England primer, and really they're going to be better educated than most of Europe. On whole. This will, of course, vary from colony to colony. The North tends to be much more educated than the South, and this has a lot to do with religious reasons. But education is going to be key, particularly when we're talking about the Revolution, because you're going to need people to be very literate to write these letters that are being passed back and forth. So the big picture of society, there's a lot of religion, education, population growth, and there's becomes this sort of like sense of being American, which is different from being British, but it hasn't quite extended into politics yet when we're talking pre-French and Indian War period. All right, so definitely remember the Puritans, what they were for, what they were against. The halfway covenant, things of this nature would be important to remember. Also, that gender roles are going to be very harshly defined, which is what's going to end up leading to the Salem witch hunts. Um, we talked about religious dissidents and political dissidents. Robert Williams is a good example of this, and Hutchinson as well. But just really this idea that if you do not conform to the Puritan ideas, you're going to be banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony and be forced to find other colonies to live in. We do see a little bit of evolution religion. The halfway covenant makes things less strict, so it's easier to join. We also see the various great awakenings and other things like this that basically are there to shake up the lane, like what is there of the religious period. Maryland passes the Act of Toleration in 1649, which basically says anyone who's here can stay. This is pretty important because this is a unique idea in history at this point. The Quakers, like I said, are in Pennsylvania, 1681. You just need to follow Quaker laws, but you do not have to be a Quaker to live there, but it does become a haven for Quakers. They offer fair treatment for Native Americans and do not allow slavery. So this is really the big picture of culture. In the North, we have the Puritans. In the South, we have more of like an idea that it should be about profit. However, we are starting to get more of a press sort of situation. The Zinger trial in 1735 establishes freedom of the press. And there is a really big culture of reading newspapers and spreading news, which again will be very important leading up to the Revolution. So this is where we stand at the eve of the Revolution. And we do have some rebellions. So Bacon's Rebellion, which you should remember pretty well, are the former indentured servants that rebel against Governor Berkeley, who are very upset about their lack of protection from Native Americans. The Pueblo Revolt, which is going on in Spanish North America, and then the Stono Rebellion, which is where the slaves kill many whites in South Carolina. They try to flee to Spanish Florida, and this leads to a lot of different restrictions that become those slave codes. And also, this is sort of setting up that precedent for Florida being this like lawless place where people run away, which Andrew Jackson is going to go after when he attacks. All right, so this is a question that we've written before. You should be able to write this. If you cannot write the answer to this question, or at least like bullet point it out, you should probably read in the overview book, just sort of glance over chapters 3 through 6, or just come in after school for tutoring and speak with me. This again would be another one that you should be able to read or you should be able to do. If you can't, again, I would read chapter 6 through 8 in the review book, and then again, also come talk to me. Here's another. Sort of the same question, but a little bit different. This one is more on religious freedoms. All right. So the French Indian War becomes very interesting in that it isn't particularly involving North America. However, this becomes like our first world war because both France and Great Britain have territories everywhere. And so, anywhere that they have territories, they go to war. So, because the French and Native Americans have very strong alliances in North America, they begin to attack British colonists. And so, the British send over protection for this. Um, this is going to change the relationship between the British and the colonists for a few reasons. One, the colonists don't understand why they were pulled into this because the only reason that they're having any problems is because of these choices that Great Britain has made. Two, they're now going to be told that they must recoup the cost of this war when they don't think that it was their fault that these costs were incurred in the beginning. Um, this is going to end that salutary neglect period. Great Britain is going to be just frankly broke, and so it's going to have to turn to the colonists to provide them with some money. Pontiac's Rebellion, the Proclamation line of 1763. One of the massive themes in U.S. history is this idea of expansion, that the United States can just expand, expand, expand. And so putting a damper on this expansion and saying you can't move any farther west of this line is going to make a lot of colonists very angry. There began to be a lot of like Revenue Acts, Stamp Act, Townsend Acts, things like this. There begins to be like some anger with this idea of no taxation without representation. That basically, if you are going to be taxed, you must have a place where you can send representatives that get to protest or vote on this tax. Um, Thomas Paine writes Common Sense, and really it's the role of newspapers, the role of other things that are spreading the word through the colonies of what's going on. So when they meet for the First Continental Congress, they send the olive branch petition to the king to ask for peace, but this is obviously not enough. Through the war, I told you to make sure that you know your first battle, Lexington Concord, your turning point, Saratoga, and then your last battle, Yorktown. Know that women were playing a big role during the war. Treaty of Paris ends it. Through it, we have the Articles of Confederation, which were incredibly weak. They could not, there was no money, no army, no law. The reason was, if you've just looked through this time period, once you feel the king was a tyrant, you do not want these things. Shays' Rebellion, however, shows us that there is a need for a strong government. And so there begins to be some idea that maybe we should have a stronger federal system. So this is Northwest Territory. We're starting to expand after this. So the Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia. Make sure you know your compromises, your Federalist Papers, J. Hamilton Madison, who support the ratification of the Constitution, and your Bill of Rights. We spent a long time on this, and next year in government you will continue to spend time on this. So from the Washington through the Adams presidency, this is really what we call the critical period, where we have that question like, are the United States going to make it? There are lots of events that happened, but I told you to make sure that you remember, one, Washington's farewell address, which basically warns against foreign alliances. I said this was incredibly important because this is going to be the dominant theory of American foreign relations for the next 100 years or so. That everyone's going to look at what Washington said and say, well, Washington said stay out, so people will really until the Spanish-American War. Looking at the Adams presidency, it's really this idea that maybe democracy is wonderful and everything, but the French Revolution has gone too far. So it's very anti-French feeling, this anti-revolution feeling, this idea that our revolution was good, but others might be going too far. The XYZ affair, the Alien Sedition Acts are all part of this. And we spend a long time thinking about the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. These were written by Jefferson and Madison, and basically they said that if the federal government were to write something that was what they would consider illegal, so if the federal government passes a law that is illegal according to the states can choose to not obey that law, to nullify it. And we said that this is incredibly important because when we have the nullification crisis in 1831, when we have the Civil War, the people that are rebelling do believe that they have legal standing, because if there are two people that know like the purpose of an American Revolution and the purpose of our Constitution I would believe that to be Thomas Jefferson, guy who wrote the Declaration, and Madison, guy who wrote the Constitution. So this becomes kind of the legal standing, the way in which these groups argue that, they do have the right to nullify federal law. So, the name of the game in the 1800s is expansion. There's lots of it. We took a test over the expansion, so I'm hoping that you know it. If you don't, perhaps just look at the map, remember why we got each part. Jefferson, the big part is the expansion, but also this idea that there should be more state power, this idea that people need to be making more decisions. And this is really going to extend through this period. We're going to get some court cases that establish our Supreme Court, that establish our court system. We're also going to get to the War of 1812, which is important for a lot of reasons, but we really focused on its importance in propelling Andrew Jackson to a place of national prominence. The era of good feelings is when everybody kind of got along, it seemed. We said the American system was probably the biggest thing to know during this because it's this vision that America should be this big unified place, that internal improvements like railroads, like canals, like roads should be used, and that we should have tariffs to protect our goods. Remember, Clay is going to be the nemesis of Andrew Jackson, and this American system, his banking, all this is going to be attacked. Monroe Doctrine is not really important in this time period, but it will be incredibly important when we're talking about the late 1800s with the Spanish-American War. Also remember your Missouri Compromise, the first of these compromises that are sort of extending the Civil War for each generation to deal with. So the Jacksonian era, we spent a long time on Jackson, so I feel like we don't need to go into him too much. And I feel like the only president you may remember is Andrew Jackson. But remember, he's very angry about his corrupt bargain. He's very angry that he thinks that maybe rumors have caused his wife to die. And so when he enters with a vengeance against both Calhoun and Henry Clay. So we have the nullification crisis, we have various things like this. But really, the Jacksonian era is an era that we say that the rights of the common man to vote increase, but also that the power of the federal government is increasing as Jackson sort of extends his power. But he's choosing which things to extend and choosing to kill other things. Remember the Native Americans, this idea that basically Jackson can decide not to enforce a Supreme Court decision, which will become a very interesting thing through the 18th and the 18th and the 1900s and 20th century as well. Remember the independence of Texas, the Mexican-American War, all these various things. Manifest Destiny, the idea that we should be expanding from shore to shore, is coined by John Sullivan. We read that article from the paper. Mexican-American War, again, this idea of expansion. Do remember on civil disobedience, Thoreau, which is later going to influence lots of other people, particularly Martin Luther King. Compromise of 1850, another one of these compromises to postpone the issue of slavery expanding. And then finally, the Gadsden Purchase bought to extend that railroad, which is going to mark the conclusion of expansion. So just prior to the Civil War, we have a lot of reform movements going on. The Second Great Awakening is really the impetus of all of this. People go to these revival movements, they come home just like very encouraged to change things. And so like from these, we get the abolitionist movement, we get the temperance, the women's rights, the education, the mental ill movements, all of these things. And all of these women are playing a huge role because women are seen as like the moral authority of the family. And so we're seeing lots of reforms in this. We're also seeing transcendentalism, which is one of the few just American literary movements. Thoreau writes Walden, lives in isolation, walks around. Emerson, self-reliance, which is one of these cornerstone beliefs in American history. Okay, immigration. Remember, we've talked about for a very long time that people that live here tend to look at people that come and say, oh, these are bad, these are immigrants, we do not like them. This is nativism. This is not new today, and it was not new in, the 1800s. We talked about the Know Nothing Party, the Order of the Star Spangled Banner, like they know nothing except that they hate immigrants. And that like these are against immigrants like those from Ireland who are fleeing the potato famine, Germany, England, and that these old wave, this first wave of immigrants, like while they don't have a great time of it, face less hard of a time than the second wave that's going to occur after the Civil War, which are the groups coming from mostly Eastern Europe, which aren't going to speak as the language, they're not going to be as educated, and so they're going to find it even harder to assimilate. We also talked about how like these Irish immigrants, them or their kids are going to be the ones being nativist and racist against this new generation of immigrants. And we looked at that image of them like putting their arms up, like barring people from getting off a ship, but in their shadow, you could see that they had come with their baggage and things of this nature. So slavery is really the issue of the 1800s. Make sure that you know your rebellions. Make sure you know how this is like escalating, but that it's taking a very long time for it to add up. The 1850s is when we said things were going off very, very intensely. We said the Compromise of 1850 was like a fire bell in the night, that a lot of this, the Compromise of 1850 was basically just putting a pause on something that was inevitable. There was that fugitive slave law, which no one in the North could particularly tolerate. And this really gets a lot of gardening of the abolitionist writings, like The Liberator, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, things like this. Um, Make sure you know your big abolitionists. We went over these quite a bit, so you should know them pretty well. And make sure that you understand like the order in which these things happened. Really, 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, many can say like is the start of the Civil War because it's blood being shed over this issue of what will be slave, what will be free. Remember, the question is popular sovereignty. Basically, they're going to let Kansas and Nebraska decide whether they would like to be slave or free. The problem is people just sort of move in and they're very angry and they're staying in the same town and they're both very, very opinionated on one role or the other. And so it's going to lead to what we call bleeding Kansas. Even on the floor of our own legislative branch, we're going to see like senators attacking one another, the caning of Charles Sumner, things like this that really help to inspire the Republican Party that are sort of seen to have the moral high ground. Remember your court case, Dred Scott versus Stanford, says that basically he's not a person, therefore can't sue. And do remember that Dred Scott's going to be the reason we need the 14th Amendment. Also, Harper's Ferry, we went over this quite a bit. So, Civil War, election of 1860, Lincoln wins. This really is that like last step towards it. He did not want to eliminate slavery. He just didn't want to extend it. However, basically, this is the cause that the South needed for secession. Do remember that the war was very controversial. There was a draft. Rich people could hire substitutes. There were draft riots, all sorts of things like this. Remember, the border states basically are being bribed to stay in by keeping their slaves. And do remember your sort of like key turning point battles, like Antietam, Gettysburg, things like this. So here's like miscellaneous stuff. Make sure you know that concept of Republican motherhood, belief that women should raise children to be good citizens. This is the idea that like women are the moral authority, which again we see over and over again in U.S. history. This cult of domesticity, that women had separate spheres than men, so that women's job was in the home with the child, men's job was outside in the world. Hudson River School, landscapes and stuff. John Marshall in the Supreme Court, do not forget him. Next year you'll talk about him a lot. And then Daniel Webster, make sure you know him. So that is it. If you have any questions, please come talk to me, but do watch all of those videos on the Geller Lehrman site if you can.